Well, Dragonflight has been out for a while, and so far at least, the good outweighs the bad. I've tried the new talent trees, and there's definitely room for improvement and a few crucial things that are missing, but in a lot of ways, it feels like it's a step up from Shadowlands, albeit in a two steps forward, one step back kind of a way. I mean, I've been missing the Rebuke spell since Legion since I play a Holy Paladin, and the good news is I got Rebuke back. The bad news is I'm absolutely required to get talents like Greater Judgment and Fist of Justice in order to get Rebuke. Instead of taking a small detour away from the talents I want, I have to take a pretty big detour into talents I don't want to get what I do want. And the class talent tree as a whole has a less than appealing design. I can kind of see why the Blizzard developers made some of their decisions, but in spite of that, I don't really agree with those decisions. I think I should show you what I think the Paladin trees should look like, and explain my reasons for doing things the way I did, and examine the apparent reasons why Blizzard created the class tree the way they did, too. Now, most classes' talent trees have one column for each spec. There's exceptions to this, like the Shaman and Hunter class trees, and, you guessed it, Paladins. To be honest, it feels like different developers were allowed to form their own design philosophies and implement them in the different trees. Paladins, Hunters, and Shaman having class trees that aren't really organized by spec is an example of that. And another is Warriors and Druids having plenty of direct damage abilities in their class trees, while most other classes have very few, or even none at all in the case of Evokers and Warlocks. I mean, seriously, Evokers are supposed to be the newfangled cool class. They get 0 direct damage abilities in their class talent trees even when they're the newfangled cool class? If I were creating an Evoker healer, I would love to be able to grab Pyre as a multi-target finisher, or Shattering Star or Firestorm. Why keep those out of Preservation Specs kits or deny players the joy of having direct damage spells as building blocks to put together their kits? Granted, there are quite a few baseline damage abilities for Evokers that don't require any talent points at all, but absolutely no direct damage spells in the class talents? Really? If every time someone suggested a direct damage spell for the class tree, the other developers working on it said, nah, we'll just baseline that, I guess I can't really get mad at that, but still, I'm really surprised that not one direct damage spell for the newfangled class landed within the class talents. Anyhow, I am left wishing that whichever developer whose design philosophy entailed making direct damage spells available as talents had been the one who designed Paladin's talent trees, and I hope that as Blizzard learns more lessons about what's fun for players, they switch over to that design philosophy. Though the other developers shouldn't feel too bad about experimenting. Knowing what doesn't work and why it doesn't work is legitimately important. I just wish they'd found a way to figure out what doesn't work that didn't involve giving players a suboptimal experience in the live game. Anyhow, with all that context in mind, I think I should talk about some other problems that I see in the Paladin class talents. Besides the lack of direct damage spells and the fact that Rebuke is cool but a little too costly in terms of being forced to spend talent points on talents that don't interest me to get the one thing that does interest me, I see right off the bat that auras are actually in the talent tree. Icky. That's just icky. Buffs like auras and greater blessings really aren't that interesting. Not to players. We hated it during Wrath of the Lich King when Blessing of Kings was something we had to spend talent points to get, and we hate it now that auras are something we have to spend talent points to get in Dragonflight, even if they are really low in the talent tree. Really, there are more interesting things that would be much, much more fun to spend talent points on. Heck, it might be an interesting thing if there were new auras, something novel and exciting and useful, like resistance auras, some kind of damage boosting aura, maybe one that upgrades versatility, and of course a healing aura like Aura of Mercy. Not the same old hat, boring, uninteresting 4 auras that we've had in our kits since the auras came back during Battle for Azeroth. The best way to think of all this is with a kind of a balance scale that has suck on one side and awesome on the other side. If a given ability is something that we used to get for free that suddenly we need to spend talent points for, that adds some weight to the suck side. If it's a long-lasting raid buff with little to no interaction, like a greater blessing or an aura that we need to spend talent points on in order to get, then that adds even more weight to the suck side. You can tell. Putting these auras as shallow talents was a force multiplier for the suck side of this scale and was not a good move from players' perspective. It kinda seems like Blizzard was vaguely aware of this on some level, since they made it so that one talent point got you 2 auras. They were attempting to put more weight on the awesome side with that. I mean, just imagine if there was a single talent point spend that got you 2 different strike abilities or 2 different direct damage spells just with that 1 point spent. That would be something absolutely awesome. But unfortunately, this feeble and tone-deaf attempt at adding weight to the awesome side of the scale isn't anything like enough to outweigh the suckiness of having old hat, formerly free buffs in our talent trees. Ugh, icky. Just icky. Hypothetically, though, let's say that there were new auras in the class tree. Well, actually, the auras I'm showing here have been in the game at one time or another, so they're only new in the sense that if the devs actually added these to the game in Dragonflight, it could be said that we didn't have them in Shadowlands and did in Dragonflight. But even that would make them new and more exciting than what we actually got. The Blizzard devs could get away with adding auras like these to the class talents, but adding Devotion, Retribution, Consecration, and Crusader auras, they really can't and aren't getting away with that. And you might notice that I had Resistance Aura in the middle, Aura of Mercy on the left, and Sanctity Aura on the right. That would be a path for Holy on the left, Protection in the middle, and Retribution on the right. And that is something we currently do not have. Protection and Holy are kind of crammed together on the left at the moment, with Retribution on the right, and the center is all cooldowns. In my opinion, this eats into the identity that the class tree ought to be providing for players. It feels like whoever was designing the class tree had the idea in their heads that things like Avenging Wrath, a spell that all paladins would want, ought to be in the class talents, and Avenging Wrath can't really go in any one spec's column, so they decided to create a new column that it could go into by inventing the cooldowns column in the middle. Now, personally, I think this line of thinking was a mistake, and I'll need to talk about a lesson I learned while doing Project Decade to explain why. In a lot of ways, I regret Project Decade. It was overambitious, and I made a fool of myself more than once, and Blizzard came up with something better in the end anyhow. But there was a silver lining to the fool's errand that was Project Decade. Attempting it. Attempting to build a new system of customization that players would find appealing taught me one of the mistakes that a designer can make while attempting to put together a customization system and attempting to make it appealing. And that is taking the stuff that players need and putting that vital and necessary stuff into your newfangled customization system so as to force players to engage with your system, just so that they can get their hands on what they need and or consider to be important. I realized, while I was doing Project Decade, that I was gravitating towards doing that. I would find abilities or invent abilities that were intended to solve the spec's problems, and then put them into my upgrades customization system. And now I see Blizzard designers are also making a very similar mistake. They're trying to make the new class talent tree look awesome by putting Avenging Wrath in the middle of it when all 3 specs need it. Even worse, the Blizzard developers are making this mistake by putting already existing abilities into the new talent system. I made the mistake by putting new abilities that were designed to solve specs problems into my upgrade system. My system was intended to be awesome by dint of adding brand new abilities that the game had never given to players before, but Blizzard's system isn't. That said, if your customization system is genuinely awesome, then you shouldn't need to force players to engage with it by putting things players need deep in your system. Of course, plenty of vital tools for a spec score rotation are in the talent trees, usually in shallow places. This I don't really perceive as a problem, especially because you get a few of the lowest talents in your class tree for free, simply by choosing a spec. In my opinion, Blizzard made an ingenious move by making the first few class abilities free. That said, the deeper the vital stuff is in the class or spec tree, the more it looks like another case of the devs trying to make lameness look awesome in all the wrong ways. Now, personally, I wouldn't put Avenging Wrath in the class tree at all, and would instead make it a baseline ability. Not everything that's cool and useful and important has to come from the talent trees. I mean, I get it. The talent trees are one of the cool features of Dragonflight, but that doesn't mean that everything cool that goes into a class's kit needs to come from the new talent trees. As a matter of fact, sometimes it's better if an ability doesn't come from the talent trees, because then we're getting it for free. And, of course, it doesn't need to fit in with the other talents, or force the rest of the tree's design to bend to make a place for it. And what would make the trees cooler and more interesting is the ability to do things that we couldn't do before in Shadowlands, like getting our hands on abilities we didn't have previously. Rebuke is an example of that for a holy paladin like me, albeit not the best done example due to its placement in prerequisites. Seriously, did they have to put it in with the offensive abilities? Wouldn't it be more of a defensive ability or a cooldown when you think about it? I guess they didn't want to inflict the lameness of forcing Retribution to take a bunch of defensive talents that they didn't want, and felt more okay with inflicting the lameness of forcing Protection to take a bunch of offensive talents they didn't want instead. Or Holy, for that matter. Really, it would have been better if Protection had its own column next to Retribution, and if Rebuke were right in between the Protection and Retribution columns. That way, both specs that need that ability to really function can get it easily, while passing through little to no lameness on the path to getting Rebuke. Another cool possibility of the new talent system that I think Blizzard really missed out on, with the Paladin class tree at least, was adding the ability to get spells and abilities that used to be exclusive to other specs. I suppose that when I saw so many spells that were core to the specs in the Druid class tree, that I was expecting other class trees to be the same way. I saw things like Swipe, Sunfire, Swiftmend, Wild Growth, Starfire, Skull Bash, and Star Surge. I figured all those core abilities being in the class tree meant that Blizzard would be opening up the possibility of each spec getting their hands on core abilities that other specs had, like Protection or Retribution getting Holy Shock, or Holy and Protection getting Templar's Verdict, or Retribution and Holy getting Hammer of the Righteous. Awesome things like that. Sadly, Druids were a unique case. They already had talents in the old talent grid system that gave them abilities that were core for other specs, and that's probably the real reason why Druids have so many direct damage and other core abilities in their class tree. Blizzard is really missing out on the chance to present players with more of the building blocks of the classes. The existing talent tree system really isn't living up to its full potential. I mean, they advertised and explained the whole new talent system as giving players the building blocks. Well, give us new blocks we didn't have before because they were cordoned off from us as soon as we picked a given spec. Make those formerly spec-specific abilities available to us if we spend the talent points to get them. In my ideal class tree, I have both Blessing of Protection and Hammer of the Righteous.